Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons, and we're going to talk about Dave Thaumavore's recontextualization of all the data in Slaying the Dragon. Ben Rigg's book from 2023, which was a history of Dungeons & Dragons, specifically Gary Gygax and Lorraine Williams. And more importantly, Lorraine Williams. And we're going to talk today about Lorraine Williams understood correctly through Ben Rigg's data. Okay, and so basically I want to talk about Ben Rigg's book real quick. I'll give you a summary of it. Ben Rigg's book kept the focus on D&D history. That was good. Ben Riggs gave us a whole bunch of different data. He listed events that happened, and he gave us data to support those events. The data in Ben Rigg's book is incredibly valuable. All of the analysis in Ben Rigg's book is flawed, not worse than flawed. It's completely wrong. Right? So Ben Riggs looked at all the data and drew a whole bunch of conclusions that were completely wrong, right? But now Dave Thaumavore comes, and you can see the link below. It's a video that breaks down Ben Rigg's very valuable book, which is completely wrong on analysis, but completely valuable on focus and on data. Okay, all right. So let's get there. So basically, we're going to talk about so what do we learn? So when we look at Dave Thaumavore's recontextualization of Ben Rigg's book, what do we learn about Lorraine Williams? Well, we learn here's what we learn about Lorraine Williams. First of all, Gary Gygax was Dungeons & Dragons' creative father. Okay, he created Dungeons & Dragons, and he really fathered it. He brought it into the world, right? Lorraine Williams, and he overcame a huge obstacle to make it a reality and make sure it didn't die during his period, which was 1974 to 1986. Then Gary Gygax went to Hollywood, and they talk about this in Dave Thaumavore's video. So Gary Gygax goes to Hollywood, gets a very bad habit, and loses control of himself, and no longer has any ability to control the Dungeons & Dragons. So you'll hear a bunch of grognards who are like, oh, Lorraine Williams kicked Gary Gygax out. That's not the case. Gary Gygax had no control of himself in 1986. Certainly couldn't control D&D, right? Because he had this monster he had met who had like attached it to himself like a carbuncle in between 1983 and 1986. And so in 1986, in my humble opinion, Gary has no control of himself. He is smart enough to say, hey, I need to give Dungeons & Dragons to somebody who's going to carry it through the next period. And the next period was the computers and video game period. Two absolute voracious predators positioned to destroy Dungeons & Dragons forever. Okay. Now, Gary Gygax has dealt with his own monster, that had come to destroy Dungeons & Dragons, and that was evangelical Christians, and they tried to destroy Dungeons & Dragons between 1980 and 1983. Satanic Panic. It didn't work. He was able to defeat them, right? So Gary is Dungeons & Dragons' creative father. Lorraine Williams is Dungeons & Dragons' commercial mother. From 1974 to 1986, Dungeons & Dragons had three leaders, okay? Gary Gygax, Don Kay, and Brian Bloom, okay? They were abominable commercial leaders. They were just the absolute worst commercial leaders you could ever imagine. So what did Don Kay do to be a terrible commercial leader? He died young, right? It was a big deal, and he had stock, and it was a huge problem. And if he had lived, he could have been a good commercial leader. It's possible. But he was a terrible commercial leader because he died young. That's the way it is, period. In order to do a good job, you need to remain alive. If you put yourself in a leadership position, maybe you should remain alive. Right? So Don Kay died. He was a bad commercial leader because he died. Okay? All right. And then Brian Bloom was a terrible commercial leader. And the reason why was he was not good with money, and he allowed the spending on he was not good with money, and he wasn't a loyal friend. And actually, you know what, I don't even know if he wasn't good with money. I think he was a disloyal friend to Gary Gygax. He did not, when they fought, he didn't treat Gary like a friend. He betrayed him, I think. So Brian Bloom was a betrayer. Okay, Gary Gygax, right, was a horrible commercial leader because he refused to understand you cannot be a commercial leader and a creative leader. You cannot do it. okay? And he didn't do it. He was an absolutely abominable commercial leader. And the commercial leadership of Dungeons & Dragons from 1974 to 1986 was abominable. Its creative leadership was incredible, right? But its commercial leadership was abominable. So basically, Lorraine Williams is handpicked by Gary Gygax, and he's like, hey, here it is. Here's Dungeons & Dragons. Carry it forward. And she does. She does everything to secure it, make sure it's safe from Gary Gygax. I know people don't like to hear that, right? But Gary was in, and you'll hear all these grognards. Oh, if only if Gary had been able to stay in position and be the creative and commercial leader of Dungeons & Dragons forever, it would have ended, right? And the reason why is Gary didn't have any control of himself, right? So he would have run it into the ground, right? Because he couldn't control D&D because he couldn't control himself, right? So, in my humble opinion, okay. So the idea that Gary was going to be the commercial leader of Dungeons & Dragons after in 1987, 19, that's ludicrous, right? He would have ran that thing into the ground, okay? So it was impossible for Gary to carry the ball forward. But he was smart enough, and he still had retained enough of himself to pick the right person, and he did pick the right person. The commercial mother of Dungeons & Dragons, Lorraine Williams, okay? So Lorraine Williams comes in, and this is really where it really gets fascinating. So Lorraine Williams comes in, and first of all, she got all the stock. She literally gained control of Dungeons & Dragons. She essentially owned it all, right? Just swept up all the stock options. And everybody's like, oh, she was a bad businesswoman. In the middle of investment banks, the Bloom brothers, the Bloom family, Gary Gygax, she effortlessly swept up every stock, right? So this idea that Lorraine Williams was, and this is what Ben Rigg's book shows, Lorraine Williams was a commercial titan. She was a commercial conqueror. And she conquered everyone, swept all of control of Dungeons & Dragons under herself so she could keep it safe like Gary asked, right? Like, and Gary couldn't keep anything safe, not himself or his family or anything, right? Like, and honestly, and it's not just me saying that, like, tell me if I'm wrong, his family fell apart, like, very shortly after, right? Like, couldn't even keep his family together, right? Like, and a lot of people think the divorce that happened with his first wife directly came from what happened in Hollywood, which I believe, right? I don't know if that's proven. In my humble opinion, that's what occurred. You can tell me if you think the evidence points in a different direction, right? And if D&D had remained under Gary, the same thing that happened to his family would have happened to D&D. It would have fallen apart, okay? All right, so here, and we wouldn't have it today. It'd be like Pogs, like a fondly remembered thing that was, not a multi-billion-dollar intellectual property that is infiltrating many, many other intellectual properties and serving as an identity engine, an achievement engine, and a human improvement engine, in my humble opinion. All right, so let's get there. Okay. So we have all this going on, right? And Lorraine Williams comes in, and she takes over, right? And then this is the part that's important, is there's been a lot of terrible analysis saying Lorraine Williams was bad for Dungeons & Dragons, which is just the most ludicrous misunderstanding of who Lorraine was and what actually happened. 1986, there was a second crisis, a real crisis. Not like today where, oh, somebody used AI, it's a crisis. No, it's not. Stop pretending, right? Like, and stop pretending it's AI art. Thank you. Right? Okay. Stop making lies. Right? Like, yeah, thanks. That would be nice. OSR and indie. Right? Like, yeah. So wild. So a real crisis, right? So what was the first crisis, right? The first crisis was the Satanic Panic. And the second crisis was video games, right? Now, honestly, the reality is computers were in there. They were just taking a garrote to the print industry. And they were just, the computer industry was behind the print industry and just with a garrote tied. And the print industry, even today, is massively in trouble, right? There's only one national chain left, Barnes & Noble. You guys remember? Do you guys remember Borders? Yeah, and Books A Million, but they're in a bunch of malls that are all dying. So, like, okay, whatever. Let's keep going. Print was very in trouble, and TSR was a print company, and TSR is a print, and Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro, is a print company today. Like, yes, Professor Dungeon Master will tell you they're going to go digital, just like people will tell you that DC and Marvel are going to stop printing comics and haven't after 80 years, right? So we have at least 30 years of physical books. I think we have, honestly, I think they'll print the Bible and they'll print comic books and they'll print D&D last. Those things will always be printed. Like 3 millennia from now, those will still be printed. And then nothing else will be important enough too, right? So, all right. So video games come in. So print is under massive threat, and video games come in, and it changes the world. Literally, like Netflix was saying, they have more threat from Fortnite than they do any other streamer, right? One video game gives them more trouble, right? And stops people from watching their content more than like Max. That's astounding, right? So the reality is video games are coming up between 1986 and 1997, and they have their stride. And so Lorraine Williams is taking over this incredibly important, very physical, very tactical, very, very physical game, right? Where they're still printing. And it's critical, like, that they continue to print, because it's sacred text, Dungeons & Dragons, comic books. Like, that is the thing that humans need, right? And so Lorraine understands this, and she comes in, and she, like, listen to this. Like, what did Ben Riggs explain? That she came in, immediately effortlessly bought, listen to the commercial expertise of Lorraine Williams. Came in, immediately outmaneuvered Gary Gygax, the Bloom Brothers, investment banks, every contender, and swept up every piece of stock for Dungeons & Dragons. Great, okay? Then what does she do? She then figures out immediately that for 7 years, Random House has positioned itself to be a cash bank for TSR, which she immediately begins to leverage to the tune of millions of dollars. And she can get cash for the company anytime she wants, right? Now you're like, oh, and people are like, Lorraine Williams was a bad businesswoman. This is so ludicrous, because having the ability to get cash into the company anytime you need it, right, is literally what every biotech Harvard graduate startup leader does today. And they all start from zero. And Lorraine figured this out within the first month of her becoming the leader of Dungeons & Dragons, the queen of Dungeons & Dragons, right? The commercial queen of Dungeons & Dragons. But she doesn't stop there. She was so commercially powerful, so brilliant, commercially brilliant, that then she took Dungeons & Dragons into factoring, right? Which I don't even understand. I had to look this up, right? So factoring was, she would take a huge order from the bigger orderers, right? And say, give me your entire order for Dungeons & Dragons right now in January, right? She would take those orders, right? And then spend the rest of the year delivering them, those orders. But she would take all those orders in January, and before January was even out, she would sell them to investor banks. Again, this is what every biotech startup leader does today, right? Get paid in cash for something you haven't even delivered, right? And this is bog standard. This is modern. In 1986, she was doing what every biotech startup leader is doing today, which is dead as a tool, brand preeminent. And that's another thing. She was brand preeminent. She was like, she stripped the names off of the fiction books, right, for Dungeons & Dragons. Everybody's like, oh, she did, brushed aside the authors. Yes, so that it was brand preeminent. It doesn't matter who wrote this book. This is a Dungeons & Dragons fiction novel. Who cares who wrote it? The star isn't Margaret Weiss or Tracy Hickman. The star isn't is not any D&D, isn't Mel Odom. The star is D&D. Brand preeminent. She was way ahead. And so the best understanding of what she did was, then she took Dungeons & Dragons massively into debt. Just like every biotech startup does today, right? Takes everything into massive debt, burns for 5-10 years to catapult the brand forward. And that's exactly what she did. And that's why we have the brand today. And so the best understanding, and if you read Ben Rigg's book, this is what you will actually, and you ignore all of the analysis, right? And then you recontextualize exactly as Dave Thaumavore invites us to do. Here's where you land, right? Then you understand who she actually was. She was Charon on the River Styx. Charon is the ferryman over the River Styx. So Dungeons & Dragons was in Earth, okay? She realized that it was going to be horrible to survive video games and the computer industry. So she took Dungeons & Dragons from Earth and brought it into the underworld, which was massive debt, right? And it looked precipitous. It looked dangerous, right? Because it was. They went into the underworld. So understand Lorraine Williams as Charon, the ferryman on the River Styx. She takes Dungeons & Dragons, puts it in the boat, takes it from Earth, takes it into the underworld for 11 years, and then delivers it to and then takes it back over the river, but not to Earth, but to heaven, right? There was a brief moment back on Earth. That was when it was owned by Wizards of the Coast, and then Hasbro was heaven. And that's where it's been for 24 years. 24 years, 1999 to 2023. And Hasbro has been the best guardian that Dungeons & Dragons ever had. And Hasbro ended up with Dungeons & Dragons. First, it was sold to Peter Atkinson for $30 million. He turned around and flipped it 2 years later for $146 million. And all of that value, the $30 million, the $175 million value, right? And then delivering it to a global property that could do all the printing for all the merchandise and could handle it as a global brand. All of that is because Lorraine Williams served as Charon, the ferryman on the River Styx, took Dungeons & Dragons from Earth to the underworld for 11 years in debt, and then took it back briefly to Earth, and then pushed it to heaven, right? And when she brought it to Earth, she put it in the chariot that was heading to heaven, which was Wizards of the Coast, and then taking it straight up to heaven, right? Which is straight up to heaven, which was Hasbro D&D, where it is now. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. What's important is when I hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.